Hello, everyone. It's great to have you with us today. Let's give it a moment still for a couple of people to join us. Great. For those of you just joined, welcome. We're glad to have you here. We'll just spend a minute or so just allowing people to enter the room as they come in. Great. It's great to have you here. We are today, we have an interesting day today, basically because on Monday we had the unfortunate moments, well, actually fortunate because it was a banking holiday and it was also Eid. And so I hope you all had a wonderful Monday and celebrated as you wanted. One thing that happened though was that we would need to recap in this session a little bit from what we had or thought about and talked about on Monday, basically because the attendance was low, understandably so, because it was on holiday. So apologies for scheduling the event on Monday exactly for that day. So this session would really be a refresher of the of some of the concepts we introduced in terms of foresight, the next steps. It's about scanning, etc. And so we changed this session just to reflect on that. So what we will do in this session basically is have a recap of the 5 important theory points we shared on Monday, and then also have ample time for questions and answers. And so we also advise you, there is a video uploaded. It's already uploaded on House Space of the session on Monday. It's very interesting and deals with a lot of interesting technical concepts, which we'll briefly run through now, but we would suggest if you have time to go and look at the video. And I just want to quickly see if there's anything in the chat from anybody. Not yet. To warm up, we would want to ask you 2 things. We are going into scanning and starting to diverge, looking broadly to the external world, outside world. And in that sense, then we want to ask you, if we as futurists say we do scanning, what do we mean by that? And maybe it would be great if you can just add that into the chat. What do you think we mean when we say scanning? Any informal definitions on that, you can please just add into the chat. What do you think we mean when we say scanning? Look for cues of where we're heading. Great, thank you, Vivian. Somebody else? In terms of looking outward, then Vivian, in terms of what the current trends are, and if we extrapolate, then looking forward. Anybody else about scanning? Great, looking at particular horizons and potential options and outcomes. Guessing, okay, Gabriella, thank you for that. Yes, obviously when we scan, we ask ourselves, but do we look 10 years or 20 years into the future? What's our time horizon? So look at a horizon and try to see options. Somebody else, look at trends, weak signals, engage in sense making. I think that was somebody, Iriana, I think you were in the session on Monday. Surprising events, trends, great, monitoring our environment. And thank you for that, Louisa, because we're going to come to the environment in a bit, looking for drivers. Great. Now, just a follow-up question before we also dive into the quick learning theory points. What do you think is the difference between a trend and a driver? Is anybody who might just want to add, what's the difference between a trend and a driver? What do you think would be a trend and what do you think would be a driver? Thank you, Michael. I see your comment. Michael, that's a brilliant way of putting it. Drivers cause the change and trends are the change. Well done in saying it that way. Factors versus outcomes. Yes, that's also a good way. The one is sort of cause and effect in a sense. A driver or a set of trends. Maybe one more from anybody. Driver sets the trends. Great. This is thank you. You've got a good theoretical background. So what we'll do is we'll quickly just recap. I'll spend about the next 10 to 12 minutes on recapping. Thank you, Hidayah. Drivers are causes of change. Yes, yes, exactly so. I'll spend the next 10 to 12 minutes just explaining some of the five learning points, the main ones, and I'll just put it up here for us. Um, what is scanning? Difference between drivers, trends, wildcards, weak signals. What does it mean to take a structured approach? Quickly looking at the S-curve, which is a very helpful way of looking at change. And then why we use diverse voices. So if that's okay with you, I'm quickly going to just dive in so that we have enough time for discussion and question and answers. The first thing really is, as we said, and I think that was one of the first comments. Let me just see, you said that, I think Vivian or Gabriela said looking at particular horizons at potential outcomes. And so when we look at the horizon into the future, we also want to look at the contextual environment outside of us. In other words, what are the changes that is happening outside, in the outside or the external environment? And that is why we do scanning. Because what this slide illustrates is that change mostly, actually always, comes from the outside. You have an external environment, maybe a contextual environment. These changes comes and it starts influencing your operating environment, whether it be your country or the specific focus of your unit. And then at a specific moment, this change affects your system or your organization, where you have to deal with that or make the relevant decisions. But change never really happens necessarily from the inside. Yes, we've got agency, but the idea of scanning is to look at the external environment, taking really a macro view beyond even what we think about policy and beyond even our sector or sectoral boundaries, really looking at the edges so that we can be proactive and see what changes are coming. So that's maybe one of the reasons we do scanning. And when we scan, then we have the following things we actually often come across. We've got weak signals, trends, drivers of change, and wildcards. And we're quickly going to just look at the difference between all of this, because it might be confusing. It really isn't that really confusing. A weak signal is an early indication of a possible change, of something that might change. It's a sign of change. It's often under the radar. It's something you will have to go and look for. You might stumble upon it, and it might be nothing. In the end, maybe a weak signal can dissipate and it wasn't a signal of anything at all, or it has the potential to become a trend and, you know, be an early indicator of a future change. That's a weak signal. And then, as we already asked about trends and drivers, you did quite well in understanding this and sharing in the chat. Trends is something that has been changing, but that can be measured. It's not necessarily statistics always, but it's something you also have a sense of, something that becomes more or becomes less. It could be opinions of people, the type of opinions they have. It could be something simple as increased cell phone usage over time, or increased or decreased number of births, or the level of CO2 or average temperatures increasing, etc., or the certain cars people would like to buy, and the shifts in those sort of consumer trends and what people's preference are. It's really indicative of change, something that is measurable. And oftentimes when we scan, that's actually what we stumble across. We come across trends, you know, seeing small changes and things we can measure. But then also we have drivers of change, and the driver is really, in a sense, a collection of trends. It's almost more thematic, almost in a sense, the bucket of all these trends and where they fit in. So where a trend is a sequential pattern in recorded data, a driver is really the force that sits behind this trend. So let me quickly give some examples. If a driver would be human-induced climate change, then the trends that are associated with that might be ocean heating, coral bleaching, increase in respiratory diseases, water shortages, etc. So that might be, the driver might be climate change, and then all these other measurable impacts or trends in a certain direction increases or decreases. Or for instance, aging population, if that's a driver of change, then what would be trends of that would be maybe improved urban planning to support mobility of older people in urban areas, or maybe increased employment opportunities for caring and for nurses, etc. And these would be trends associated with the larger driver of aging population. Maybe a final one, if there's low public spending or not adequate service delivery, for instance, and there's roads with potholes, that might be a trend. The state of the roads are decreasing, and that also might have an effect on the type of vehicles people might buy, or opportunities for market opportunities to sell water, because maybe the water services in terms of service delivery is not up to speed or adequate. And these measurable impacts will really be because of, or shifts, trends would really be because of a driver of change, which might be service delivery or a lack of public spending. And then the final one is wildcards. And these are usually unexpected, low probability events, but they have a very high impact should they happen. The most notorious or popular one of these would be, for instance, an asteroid strike. And what happens is a wildcard is always an event. It's not a trend, it's not a driver of change, it's an actual moment, an event, and it's something that's not reversible. When it happens, and it has an holistic impact. And it's often something that we don't expect, that's very unlikely or not probable to happen. But should it occur, it will have a tremendous impact on where we are. Could you give us some examples of how better to detect weak signals? I think that is the art of scanning, because often some of the weak signals you might stumble across, Martin, might not be weak signals. They might dissipate and not, a trend might be, it might start to form, and then it, might die early and not really become anything significant. So it really is about, it's a little bit of an art, I guess. But I think what helps is if you have one or two or three several weak signals that might be similar and that can confirm one another, that's already, then you can say, but these weak signals have the likelihood to become a trend. Some examples, for instance, in the theory session on Monday, we had something about take home DIY kit, which you can order, a mail order, which is a CRISPR kit where you can CRISPR bacteria for a certain purpose. I can't remember for what it was, but it's for educational purposes. But it just indicated the fact that a technology such as CRISPR can now actually become something you do at home, doing this in this case for bacteria, and it shows the weak signal a little bit about the democratization of technology or health technology, indicating the increased access and really the democratization of that. I don't know, Martin, if that is a useful thing. So it's usually things that are on the fringe things that are not really obvious and people don't really talk about, and it's really novel. If you can hold on for a moment, when we get to the S curve, we can see where the weak signals lie. Then I'm quickly moving on for time so that we have time for discussion. Then we also say the third thing we want to communicate is that it's important to have a structured approach, because you can easily get overwhelmed when you start to look at the future and scanning and everything that's out there in the external environment. So upfront, it's useful to have a framework for yourself to decide how you're going to look at the future and explore. And so one of the most popular and easily accessible frameworks really is STEEP, which stands for social, technology, economy, environment, and politics. And then what happened also was over time, for instance, if it's about travel or about domains or industries that are highly regulated, they lately added regulatory or legal for the L, which stands for legal or regulatory, and also values. Specifically, I think the values was added by Steve specifically from the Australia and specific regions, because the type of features they do also often focuses about on worldviews and values, etc. So you would have come across this as steeple, steep V, steep. There are many different ones related to that. So, and that helps us to have a structured approach so that when you scan, you can put it into one of these categories. Obviously, it depends on the type of project you have or the experiment you do. If it's, for instance, for RCOs or national country planning or regional planning, then STEEP would be a pretty good acronym to use, thinking about the economy of the region, the environment. But if you're doing something maybe about youth development and youth apps or something around youth technology use, STEEP will also help, but the characterization of that might be different. You might be asking yourself, but how did youth use technology to live their social lives, or how do they use technology to make payments and interact and do business, or how they might use technology to voice their opinions in terms of politics. So still you have to adjust it a little bit to the focus of your experiment. But the whole reason for doing this is to make sure that you don't have a blind spot. For instance, you totally miss environment, or you don't think at the social aspects of all, which could be detrimental, because there might be things that have an influence on your work. And so I've got 3 more slides, and then we can have quickly conversations and questions and answers. One way we use this really is not to put the scanets and our findings when we scan into some sort of report, because we really want to have conversations around that. So we often make cards like this. Sometimes there are more details, sometimes less, but it's easy to communicate, and it helps us to have interactive conversations, sharing these cards with people, and let's talk about what we find, which is really participatory and helpful at this point in any foresight experiment. Usually we have a headline, we've got a category. You can see this one is in the environment category. We took steep here. There's a description. Sometimes the description can be a question, a data point, or a quote, but just enough information to help people set the scene. And again, it could be different given the type of experiment you have. If it's a regional experiment or a national country office experiment, it might be strongly linked to drivers of change. For instance, urbanization or aging population. But we often use these cards for inspiration as well. And then we actually add specific scan hits. For instance, if it's about the future of art or the future of art galleries, which might not be as useful for this our contingent, but for instance, we'll have a picture of how, or a scan it of how 5G might be used, in museums in the future, or VR, etc. And just in a way to provoke and elicit conversations and help us imagine the future. So these are just one of the ways we take a structured approach, translating our scan it into the cards. For conversation. And then the second last slide, we really want to share with you the S curve as well. And this is very, very useful. It shows the nature of change, and especially how an issue or a trend or a driver usually gains momentum. And Molitor, it's based on Molitor's model of change, and he coined the terminology at the bottom, which says framing, advancing, and resolving. And on the left-hand side, Martin, also to maybe link to your question, on the left-hand side, you usually have the weak signals. It's really the start of trends which you don't necessarily recognize. These weak signals are, you get it maybe in sci-fi or crazy fringe ideas people might have, or dissident voices, or contrary perspectives. And it's not really yet on the radar. And then at some point, there's maybe a framing moment, because people don't really know what to make of it, and there might be an event or some sort of framing event or idea that really puts it on the radar, and suddenly people will start talking about it. You'll get it in specialist journals or websites. It will get into magazines, mainstream media. And at some point, this trend or this issue then advances, where you will in the end get legal disputes, and it becomes a moment of policy for that specific trend. And you get government institutions accounting for that in their planning, and and even received wisdom, lessons learned, writing doctorates, etc. And that is then how the issue or the trend really develops over time. For instance, at a certain so for instance, a framing event would be an announcement. Tesla might say back in the past, but we're going to develop electric vehicles, or whatever, or Bitcoin suddenly becomes something people could invest in, while previously it might not have been, for instance. So there's this framing event that really sets it into a trajectory that brings it to an S-curve. Even just like climate change, for instance. Before Al Gore's movie, we had environmental protection, but nobody were really, conscious of the fact that things, the whole notion of climate change, it was in the back of our minds, but we didn't really think of it. It was being framed, and then suddenly it became this trend that started to eventually went into policy discussions and decisions, etc. So when you scan, it's helpful to look on the left-hand side. You will not get much worth on the right-hand side, but at the bottom there where some things are new and novel. And then the last slide I quickly just want to share also is, when you scan, it's useful to have diverse voices, and to make sure that you set up your sources in a way that it really accounts for ideas and notions outside of the organization, emerging areas of change, and leading edge thinking, or thinking on the edge. Try to understand the dynamics and speeds of these different changes. The S-curves of each change works differently. Develop new ideas and maybe link that with your current research to see how you can capitalize on what you've already done, and begin stakeholder outreach and engagement. And my last comment maybe is the picture on the right-hand side is a diagram which Andrew used in the British Cabinet Office, and it was trying to define the relationship of the futures team within the organization. And it was a little bit like a satellite going around the organization, but having a clear steer of what the organization's needs is and how they can be supported, but at the same time also going around the organization and linking with these think tanks, dissidents, other voices, critics, etc., to make sure that you can bridge the needs of the organization and the outside or external environment. And I think that's enough theory for now. You can watch the video, but I would really like to quickly put us into a moment of questions and answers. So let me quickly scroll up here and see. Is that I'm looking at Martin's comment that often end up with casting instead of foresight as we wait for a weak signal to become a more widespread trend. So how can we better sift through different types of weak signals, e.g. stronger and weaker weak signals, when we might have a matrix for this? I don't have a matrix for this. I know there's been some thinking, and we can try and pull that also. There's a lot of thinking about wildcards and different classifications of wildcards. Weak signals, not so much, but Martin, I'll make a note and see what we can get and maybe share. For me, a weak signal becomes useful the moment it's been confirmed by another one. So unless there are people who are very good at this, really has a feel of what the future might look like, but in essence, a weak signal really becomes useful, for me at least, the moment we have 2 or 3 that confirms one another, if that makes sense. And yeah, and so there's also always a risk in spending too much time on that, not really be able to. And also it also depends on what signals you're looking for. If it's something the type of project and your time horizon, maybe weak signals for thinking about how the year 2100 might look like is not that important, but weak signals for the next 5 years or 7 years is more useful and important. So, but Martin, I'll take a note of your comment and question. Are there typical websites where we start scanning that you have bookmarked? For SWAF, what we usually do is we look at existing reports and scanning, and then we do our own scanning. So usually we start to see what's out there already so that we don't reinvent the wheel. Maybe there's great expert publishings or reports being published, maybe global risk reports, etc. And we'll start from there and then see where the gaps are and start to look to see what we can scan and also which voices we need to account for in our experiment. So So and sometimes when we go into scanning, we really use, after looking at the reports, we really use just Google, and try to find keywords, map the keywords and try as best as possible to find useful sources. As I said, the reports aren't always the fringe ones. The fringe ideas you might get in interesting websites like Reddit or etc. So it's also a little bit of an art, but basically we use Google. Um, any other questions on any of these? We've shared about the weak signals, trend drivers, categorizations, the S curve, and maybe positioning yourself and your organization with also with the sources and the outside information.
Johan, may I say something really quick?
Yeah, yes, please do.
I just noticed there was a message in the chat from one of our colleagues, Aham, and he's asking about the S-curve particularly and how we adapt it to our UN context. Maybe it could help us to understand, you working with governments, how do they start adapting these different groups? Because it's also a question of, do we adapt this curve to the UN, or or does it go the other way around, right? Because these are different groups of people that we do need to include. So how do we do it in a way that also brings value to these diverse data points and groups that are providing information? And I think this also ties a bit with the, how do we connect these weak signals, and how do we make sure that these weak signals are aligned to real-time data and not just reports that maybe show up a few months or even a year in. So if you have any insights, examples from governments that you like to share with us, that could be really helpful.
So great. So I think maybe to answer, the weight of this is the clients usually are those that are at the top of the S curve. A government, maybe a big organization such as the UN or UNICEF, etc., which have not long term, but which have planning for the next 4 or 5 years. They're dealing with the situation as is, and they don't necessarily have time or capacity to look forward. So spending time at the bottom of the S curve is difficult because it's not part of their everyday organization. So that's usually, if it's in terms of weight, I would picture that most of the organizations represented here, or the units or agencies, would sit really at the top of government being institutions to that extent. So it's then more a matter of trying to get those voices at the bottom of the S curve on the left-hand side and include that. And that is why we speak of having diverse voices. There's also a difference between the experts, which you can see would be the specialist journals, etc., versus the creatives and the poets. And it's really trying to make sure that we account for the bottom of the S curve to be most represented in. That's really where you look for to see what will happen next. Often in a movie, there will be an interesting idea, and then 10 years after that, it will be an actual thing that is happening, and which 10 years after that becomes sort of at the level of policy. So that's just maybe a little bit about the S curve. So I would, and that's maybe where the youth is also extremely valuable, also in terms of weak signals, because they think differently. We often say that the future lives in people's minds before we see it in real time and reality playing out. And so maybe the youth voice and the way they see the world, along with their creativity and the energy they have, is often a very interesting indication. And that is developing your sensing network, making sure that you've got these, not just experts, because experts is excellent to help us frame and understand the issues, but often they might be blind because of their own assumptions and their own traditions and own work. There's a set of bias built in, and that's why you also need the dissident voices, the radicals, and trying to understand what they say, even though it's different than what our expectations and assumptions usually are. I don't know if that's useful, Claudia, and if you have something to add, you're more than welcome.
Thank you, Johan. It is, and I think the way you've explained this is a helpful process as well for us. When we start looking at weak signals, they can come in many shapes or forms, and they haven't been fully defined yet. They're in a way hints or clues as to where we want to get at. And then working with both experts as well as different opinions, and maybe we can also change the way we say experts, because then there's people that might have different perspectives and not necessarily academically experts in one area, but maybe that's a topic for a different discussion. But just validating these ideas. So once you have a potential clue, a weak signal, then validating it both with thought leaders and academia, as well as the different groups that might be impacted or influenced by these, or might have a different idea on it. And that would actually help us build that weak signal and see if there's a potential trend that will come out of it, or something that we need to continue flagging and studying. Right? Correct me if that's
no. You're phrasing it very beautifully, and I think a big aspect of this is also participation. You know, having conversations and allowing room for that. And we don't always have time because there's work to be done. We're chasing deadlines. It's connected to funds. We have to perform and give outputs, being outcome based, and having room and space for that conversation to distill these weak signals and trying to figure out what's next takes time and resources we don't always want to dedicate, but I mean it's very important for us to do. I think for this, the time's really up. There's two more things I want to ask you just in terms of next steps. Chantal, thank you. I think we'll add your comment also. One thing is that we suggest that you use the house space question and answer section specifically for this. And if you've got a question, we'll make sure that we'll answer everyone or respond to each question specifically around this theory as well, because Monday was a bit difficult for us. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to add that on house space. And then what we want to ask you is, there is a challenge which we would really like you to do by Monday, because we're thinking of using that in Monday's session already, but we want to ask you to find one scan hit around the future of global governance and multilateralism. And that can be anything: technology, economic, social. We use STEEP, but find one scan hit and to share that. And the way we want you to share that is to turn it into a slide of your own. And we will put this up on house space on this module so you can have a reflection and see this. But like here you see there's a title, there's a subheading, there's a description, a little bit about the date and keywords, and maybe a picture just to share. Here's another one. And so we would invite you to create your own slide. To that end, we have a template on house space, which we will share in the outgoing email. And you can just fill that out. So there's a template and you can just add that to the relevant category, social, around STEEP. If there's any questions, please also ask on the question and answer session, but I think this is fairly obvious. You can just use this example and find an scanning hit that relates to the future of global governance and multilateralism. And it can be in any of the STEEP categories. That's the one thing we ask. And then secondly, well, that's actually the only thing we ask. Then secondly, on Monday, we're moving from this to systems, thinking a little bit how this links to systems theory. We'll have a learning group moment on the 10th of May. And then on the 12th of May, we've got an hour session talking about the experiments and fleshing that out a little bit more. I don't know if there's time, Claudia, if you want to say anything about that. If you want to, you don't have to, but about the experiments clinic.
We'll share additional information on the next week as well, since this is only coming up on Friday, next Thursday. But the point of this experiments clinic is to actually dedicate time to your future experiments that you want to work on. So this is different than the learning groups you've been having, and more about jumping in and helping you identify a potential scope for your experiment. We'll discuss much more next week as well.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to stay on for another 10 minutes if there are any questions and answers, but questions or things we want to discuss. But in terms of the session, we have concluded. Thank you so much for being here, and see you on Monday.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. For those staying in, do you have any particular questions to Johan or myself?